The Horror Diary, Chapter 1. I dare you, Aaron said. He motioned his arms in lazy, swooping arcs above the train tracks. Kendra gulped, her scrawny fists clenching and unclenching. Even in the cool night air, sweat budded on her forehead, sticking to her bangs and threatening to drip. No, Kendra, don't, George replied. He wore a tattered sweatshirt over his gaunt body, his black hood pulled over his head. He coughed and his breath clouded over him like a gray beard. Come on, Aaron prodded, hopping from one foot to the other. The train is almost here. Aaron's eyes flashed under his wool beanie cap, his double chin stretching with every smile. Kendra looked at the pin of light in the distance. She guessed that the train was a few miles away, but she felt the heavy beam of light flooding over her as if it was rounding the nearest bend. Far off, the locomotive's whistle could be heard. Kendra shivered violently under her rain slicker and crossed her arms for warmth. I don't know, how many do I have to do? She asked with uncertainty. Just see how many times you can run back and forth across the tracks before the train is too close, Aaron challenged. I've seen a kid run across it 45 times before he almost got run over. Aaron, shut up, George chimed in, sending Aaron a dirty look. Kendra looked across at the advancing train, then back to Aaron. He was in 7th grade while she was only in 4th, and middle school had become a bright fascination for her that Aaron was too cynical to return. She thought it was cool to have several different teachers instead of just one, but Aaron insisted that it was much worse. She didn't have any friends in her grade besides George, who had been her neighbor all 7 years of her life. George happened to be good friends with Aaron, and Kendra looked for any opportunity to tag along with. Stop, Aaron, she's just a girl, George blurted. Kendra hung her head, fighting back tears. George had been her neighbor and friend for the longest time, and they'd done a lot together, but sometimes he could be a real jerk. Hey, relax, that's what I did when I was her age, Aaron replied. Kendra stepped suddenly onto the tracks, skipping gingerly from track tie to track tie, then she darted back, returning Aaron's smile. Kendra, you don't have to impress him, George snapped. Aaron just wants to make you look like an idiot. I don't need you to look after me, okay? Kendra ran back across the track, and Aaron started to count loudly under his breath. I just want to beat 45. It's fun, George, Aaron said, scratching his jutting belly. Just be cool. No, cut it out, George barked. He marched forward, pulling Kendra off the train track by the hood of her rain slicker. No, Kendra cried, ripping away from her friend's grip. George reeled away from her, gritting his teeth. Fine, okay then, he yelled. He turned to walk up the hill. The train whistle blasted harshly, stealing every other noise from their ears. Then George was over the hill, his head bobbing out of view. Go ahead, girl, Aaron insisted, waving his hands in the air. Kendra nodded and skipped across the tracks, counting every hurried lap and keeping an eye on the oncoming spotlight, almost a mile away now. She was on her 10th lap when her tennis shoe wedged in between two of the ties, sending her teetering forward. Her knees connected with the steel track, and she heard a sickening crunch. She fell in a full sprawl, at a loss for breath, and her hands reaching for the sky. She desperately yanked at her foot, but found it stuck tight. Aaron ran away from the tracks, yanking his backpack over his shoulder. Help! Me! She yelled after him. The train whistle blared with a deafening screech. The light fell over Aaron like an accusing eye. It's too late! I'll get hit if he stammered. He backed slowly up the hill. I can't! Please! Kendra cried, fingers reaching out for Aaron. He only shook his head before running off, looking back once but never slowing. Please! Her cries were drowned out by the heavy whistle of the locomotive. She heard the screech of brakes, brilliant sparks spraying like fireworks. The train blew its horn once more. She threw up her hands, screaming at the top of her lungs, but it went unheard. Strong hands grabbed her under the armpits and wrenched her out of the way of the train, and she landed in a heap on the ground. She looked up in time to see her father landing right next to her in the grass, his hands over his head to avoid the hailstorm of sparks. She lost time. All she knew was the screech of the train's brakes and a distant pain in her leg. She was on her back in the bushes, staring up at the blinking stars with cloudy eyes. One eye filled with sweat, and she turned her head to the side. She found George lying twisted by the edge of the track next to her. His eyes were blank, mouth frozen in awe. She slipped in and out of consciousness, eyes flitting open and closed. From somewhere she could still hear the rumble of the train and could feel it thundering under her body, and she knew it was still rushing by. She blacked out again, and when she came to, it was to the sound of screaming. It was a child. Somehow she managed to turn her head to see who was behind her, and what she saw knocked her out again like a knuckle punch. Before she sank into sweet unconsciousness, she had time to process what she'd just seen. Her father was kneeling over the body of Aaron, his fingers digging into the boy's face and neck. Blood spurted up in scarlet torrents as Aaron choked on his own blood. His arms and legs slapped wetly with the grass and then went still. She could hear her father groaning as though lifting a heavy weight. The muscles underneath his jacket were straining, all the tendons standing out in his neck. He yanked at a strip of flesh, revealing cold bone underneath. Kendra was aware of being lifted into the air, with hands she recognized as her father's, warm, sticky, and wet. The last thing she saw was her father's upturned face, streaked red and black, his eyes fixed to some distant point. His face shone misty blue in the moonlight, like a campfire storyteller shining a flashlight. Chapter 2. While Kendra's father, Mr. Simpson, rehearsed the story each day, ranting at the ceiling in one of his usual spells, he only mentioned George and Aaron once. This was right after the accident, after Mr. Simpson carried Kendra home and called the police. She remembered watching him from the couch, through the archway into the kitchen. He appeared so calm with the cordless phone against his ear, absently playing with a sticky note on the fridge. The blood stood out bright and red on his white polo shirt and face. She wondered why he didn't bother to wipe it off. When he was finished, he returned to her side on the couch and made sure she was comfortable with the blanket. He insisted that she go right back to sleep. She'd had a bad scare, and he was so relieved she was okay. A warm hand caressed her forehead and teased her bangs. She asked him what happened to Aaron and George, and he sighed, his expression unchanging. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. They're gone, trying to save you. But they were too late. They left you to die, but changed their minds. Maybe if they did the right thing first, they'd still be here." A dark shadow fell across his face that Kendra could not mistake. He was furious at the boys for putting her in danger. Even though he said he was sorry, she could tell he was happy they got their punishment. Her lips trembled. She had memories of the bright cascade of sparks, like a wave ready to sweep her out to sea. She remembered George's empty eyes and open mouth. There was another memory that couldn't be real. In it, her father had peeled Aaron's face off his skull. But, your friend George stepped on the tracks trying to pull you out, Mr. Simpson continued. He hushed her dreamily. "I got there just in time, but George couldn't get out of the way in time. I'm so sorry. I had to focus on you." Kendra swallowed hard. It hurt to speak. It hurt to breathe and keep her eyes open in the swimming display of her own tears. And Aaron?" Mr. Simpson's eyes went dark in the light of the nearby lamp. "The same thing happened to him. The train got him, honey. There was nothing I could do." At that moment, Kendra's mom burst through the door, exasperated with the news. She broke down on her knees in front of the couch, crying into Kendra's hands. As well as sad, Kendra was surprised to see how happy she was, smiling through her tears. Kendra didn't know what she could be so happy about. 2 boys were dead now, because of her. Though she accepted her father's story that night with a deep sleep to carry her into the next morning, she began to search her memories the next day. What gave her the most anxiety was the realization that her memories and her father's story did not coincide. She had even watched the nightly news the next day against her parents' strict instruction to learn that both George and Aaron's bodies had been found on the train tracks, both pulverized past recognition. That didn't make sense, because she had seen both bodies lying next to her in the grass, safely out of the train's way. And George had been recognizable, although somewhat waxy, as if his skin had been replaced. As the days turned to weeks, she was able to convince herself that everything she saw had only been a dream, kicked up by a very traumatizing event. Her dad was a hero, not a killer. He'd saved her, risking his own life. Then the police were knocking on their door and visiting with her parents at the kitchen table, asking questions. They wanted to talk to Kendra too, but the Simpsons refused. It wasn't long after that Kendra began to see a change in her father, which soon spread to her mother. He became irritable at night and lethargic in the morning. He would either lie around in complete silence, speaking very little, or erupt into violent tirades at night, smashing dishes and threatening Mrs. Simpson, although he never hurt her. The stress had gotten to Mrs. Simpson, sending her into unexpected fits of tears and helplessness, which were so hard for Kendra to see. All she could do was run off to her own private quarters and try to restrain her own burning tears. Kendra could neither be angry like her father or fearful like her mom. She could only escape her surroundings through drawn pictures and written stories of heroes and monsters. Her favorite imaginary character was the mystical horseman Dark Horse in his quest to defeat the evil sorcerer Boone, who threatened the future Earth. She wrote pages and pages about her hero on the college-ruled lines of her notebooks and then played out the very real scenes in her dreams. The more she escaped, the worse her parents became. They soon had to move so that her dad could get medical attention in another state. The drugs they prescribed for him did little for his violent outbursts, but allowed him to sleep for much of the day. He could no longer work because of his unstable condition and also complained of a tortured back, injured the night he pulled Kendra off the tracks. He would talk to himself, scream at the empty room. He punched holes in the walls and would be peaceful the next second, staring blankly into space. Kendra was much too uncomfortable to stay in the same room with him. She hardly ever saw her mother except at dinner after she returned from a long day working 2 jobs. Now that her husband was unfit to work, she was the sole provider for the house, and her strength was quickly waning. Kendra would help her to prepare the meals, but they were never to the satisfaction of her father, who hardly ate anything that wasn't liquefied and forced down his throat by a doctor or his wife. Kendra would often punish herself under spells of guilt and pity for her father, who had quickly deteriorated because of her. If she ever felt the pain, revisit it from her memories of that night. She would escape to her fantasy worlds to cook up new adventures. Usually it was enough to steal her attention from the darkness creeping around her house and around her parents. Since the night of the accident, Mrs. Simpson kept Kendra shut inside the house, fearful that she might put herself in danger again. As much as Kendra hated this punishment, she wondered if she really deserved it. Gradually, Kendra learned to be content indoors and could create fantastic other worlds without ever leaving her bedroom. Worlds that far exceeded the majesty of anything she could find outdoors. Whenever she thought about going outside, she could only think about blood on steel train tracks, and would recede back inside. The Simpsons moved a total of 4 times after the accident, and Kendra stopped trying to make friends at her new school, confident that she'd only move again. This was fine with Kendra, who could only think about her best friend smashed under the weight of a steel locomotive. So she brought her drawings and stories to school with her, stashed inside her desk. It was her very intention to be ignored by everyone, so that she might disappear one day. Soon, Mrs. Simpson would pull Kendra out of school altogether, positive that she could only be safe within the home, even though Mrs. Simpson was gone all hours of the day and Mr. Simpson was in no condition to look after his daughter. Her father's health was getting worse, and Mrs. Simpson thought it was important to try a new doctor in another state, or change locations for more agreeable weather conditions. The cold intensified Mr. Simpson's bad spells, while the heat seemed to do the same. Kendra noticed that she always packed her bags right after the police came by the house, hoping to speak to Mr. Simpson. These policemen didn't wear uniforms, but normal street clothes. They were detectives, Mrs. Simpson told her, and they were monsters. They were dedicated to hurting her dad, as she was told. But whenever the detectives rang the doorbell, it didn't hurt Mr. Simpson any. He usually remained in his chair in front of the TV during their visit, staring off into his own world. The detectives didn't exist wherever he was, nor did Kendra or her mom. Chapter 3. Their new house was larger than the others, which surprised Kendra. She knew that money was tight ever since the early stages of her father's sickness. Mrs. Simpson assured Kendra that they'd gotten a great deal on the house. Nobody wanted to live there. Kendra didn't understand because the house was magnificent. It was old, built with sharp archways and rooftops with even sharper points. The stairs and the boards creaked whenever Kendra walked. The windows were stained with a murky haze, which gave the natural light inside the house an underwater feel. Her father was rarely ever seen, sleeping his days away in his bedroom on his cocktail of medications. He hardly spoke to his wife or Kendra, but would sometimes wander downstairs in a sleepwalker crawl to find his daughter playing on the carpet. He would sometimes reach out as if to take her hand, but would then close it in a fist to shake at the wall. Kendra would make sure to retreat from the room as he cursed and spat, his wife trying to console him back up the stairs. There were so many rooms to explore, each empty, painfully unclean in her mother's inability to enjoy the new house. They didn't have enough stuff to fill the rooms, so Kendra spent most of her days pretending they were uncharted territories. She could almost see her worlds projected on the walls. In a flash, she could see jungle vines creeping down the corners of the room, or the spray from a tropical waterfall as it tickled her nose. The basement was her favorite space because it was so dark and creepy. Whenever she ventured down the steps, she didn't know what to expect in the darkness, or what creatures might be lurking behind the many boxes left behind from the last owners. Most of the stuff wasn't her parents', and Kendra liked to sort through it, finding mostly moth-eaten clothing and volumes of encyclopedias and other books without pictures. In one of the boxes, she found a diary with a shiny plastic cover. A title on the inside page claimed the diary belonged to Ben Knight. She opened it and began reading. The penmanship was beautiful, with swooping cursive loops and dark blue ink. It read, "The Soul Tower stands at the center of Arts Park, casting a shadow along the park's cement walkway. Further along the path is the park's picnic area where people enjoy their lunches with a beautiful view of the Crimson Lake. Up ahead is a playground area where people play frisbee or walk their dogs. At the very center of Arts Park, sculptors display their works openly for the public. The walkway makes a complete circle around Soul Tower, the 108-foot-tall monolith carved from bronze. The tower itself looks like large metal blocks stacked on top of one another, each smaller than the last. Sitting at the apex of Soul Tower, aka Tower of Power to the locals, is a grinning stone gargoyle. Alongside the path are a handful of other statues, each from a separate artist. One of the statues is of a cowboy sitting on his dormant horse. His rock hand is held up to his brow, shielding his blind eyes from the sun. The plaque titles the statue, "The Long Road Ahead." On the opposite side of Soul Tower is a marble sculpture of a knight, wielding its 3-foot sword at the walkway, almost as if it is guarding the path. All the statues are life-size, except for the last piece of art, situated on the adjacent side. This statue is carved from wood by a Hawaiian artist. It is a tiki man sitting on his haunches, his hands held together, a wide clownish grin on his mug. He has a Hawaiian headdress on his massive head, with several different patterns and characters carved into it. His large belly falls over his knees, while different types of necklaces hang from his neck. This statue stands 12 feet tall and 7 feet thick. It is the oldest piece of artwork in Arts Park and is considered the most popular piece besides Soul Tower. Arts Park is a place to respect and enjoy ethnic and highly priced pieces of artwork. It is a well-kept park, a place for family, a place for friends, and a place for art lovers. The next few pages of the journal included detailed sketches of all the different statues in the tower. Kendra wondered if the park really existed, because Ben could describe it with the closest details, which almost made her think she'd been there before. She was fascinated by the drawings in the book and attempted to copy them herself. Hours were spent poring over the materials in the diary, until Kendra had successfully created an imaginary space she could explore from any room in the house, where she pretended to admire and peruse the many art pieces on the grounds. Sometimes she even envisioned herself climbing to the top of the tower where the gargoyle sat. She also enjoyed watching the imaginary people come and go, toting small children and tugging their pets by the leash. The air almost seemed fresher there, as if a bubble was set over the grounds to protect it from the outside poisons. Arts Park became a refuge for her to clear her mind and forget all the festering troubles apparent in her lost life. She made sure to spend at least an hour there a day in hopes of again rekindling that happiness she had almost forgotten was still possible. In her dreams, she visited Arts Park for real. In one dream, Kendra peered up into the glare of the sun, beating off the heavy bronze surface of Soul Tower. Through the glare, she could see 2 red eyes watching her from the very top. She could also hear the soft cackle of laughter and see the red steam pluming off the tower like an ominous sign. She knew she was the only one who could see it and hear the laughter, even though the park appeared to be empty without a single dog barking. She played nervously with her hands as she locked eyes with the thing on top of the tower. Inhaling, she stood frozen at the base and tried to relax. She recoiled backward as if slapped, her vision revolving like a mad spinning ball. Kendra strained to regain it and recover from the terrific pain in her head. She took another steady breath and focused her vision. What she saw was like looking through a warped fishbowl. At the top of the tower, she saw something stir inside the mist and knew it to be the gargoyle. 2 red, piercing eyes bore down on her, a long, forked tongue flitting through the scarlet stream. "He's waiting for his victim," a voice said behind her. She turned to see a boy standing next to the tiki statue, patting the wooden belly with his hand. He looked to be a young teenager, thick blonde hair and dark jeans and a t-shirt. He smiled at Kendra. "Victim?" Kendra asked in the dream. "He's been waiting a long time for one man. The bad man," the boy replied. "He'll come back here one day, and when he does, the gargoyle will get him." "This is your park, isn't it?" Kendra asked. The boy beamed, shaking his mop of blonde hair up and down. "I always wanted to build this park when I grew up. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things." The boy looked up at the grinning tiki man. Kendra had to perform a double take when the wooden head turned on its neck. It seemed to grin even wider. "Why didn't you ever build it? It's really beautiful," Kendra said. The boy frowned. "I did build the park. You're in it right now." Kendra slowly eased out of the dream and opened her eyes, the boy's voice still real in her ears. She looked around at the shadows in her bedroom, half expecting the boy to be standing in the corner watching her. She shivered and pulled the covers over her head. Chapter 4. More and more Kendra dreamed of Art's Park. Ben was always there and was always kind and interactive. He would remember certain things discussed in other dreams and would sometimes run right up to her, so happy for her to return. Kendra never became lucid in her dreams, but recognized Ben every time, just as excited to see him. They would laugh and play in the park with dogs and other kids. They would climb on the statues, which would sometimes come to life and walk around. Kendra rode on the back of the bronze horse with the cowboy and played patty cake with the wooden tiki man. Ben liked to play sword fight with the knight statue, their swords clanging with real action, and Kendra sometimes forgot it was just pretend. Kendra loved to go to sleep at night because she always ended up at Art's Park with Ben, ready to pick up where they left off. It was a magical realm that she could see no darkness in, except for the gargoyle. It was always watching them from its high perch, complete with red eyes and smoke, which never seemed to extinguish. The gargoyle was a constant reminder of the fear that Kendra carried with her, something she was reminded of every time she peered up at the top. Ben told her not to worry about the gargoyle. It would never hurt her. There was only one man it had eyes for, and whenever Ben told her that, she saw his eyes go dim, his mouth thin and stretched. "Where do you live?" Kendra asked him one day in the park, his face screwed up confusedly. "Why, I live here." "You don't live in a house?" "I did, once. It was a long time ago." Once she even ventured to ask him who was the man he was waiting for, who would ultimately be the gargoyle's victim. "A bad man that hurt me once," Ben said. As he said that, his face changed, and she saw that he was bleeding from the mouth, his clothes now gone to reveal his naked body covered in bleeding, lacerations, and sores. Kendra screamed her way out of the dream, bursting up out of her covers in a sweat. This did little to reassure her because she could still see the red image of Ben in her mind, in all his glory. When she went to sleep, she didn't always dream about Art's Park. Sometimes she returned to the gully with the bloody train tracks. In one dream, she left her house and walked into the greenbelt. The rising sun lit up the morning as a distant guiding light, the breeze stirring in its cradle. Her sneakers dug into the soft soil, caking her soles in mud. She tore out of the brush to find the lonely train tracks, rusted with age just as she'd left them. She intended to stand in the middle of the tracks, as much as it scared her, and then she noticed the boy watching her from across the tracks. The boy made his way down the hill and stood by the very bushes Kendra had once laid after her father saved her. She recognized the boy as Ben and waved at him. He returned the gesture with a smile, but did not move to cross the tracks. "Hey, Ben," she called. "Hi, Kendra," the boy said shyly, looking around. "Where are we?" Kendra frowned, staring at the tracks. "This is where I almost got hit by a train. My dad saved me, but—" "Who died?" Ben asked suddenly. Kendra sniffed, clenching her fists. She tried to tell herself not to cry, that she was stronger than that, but Ben sensed her distress and changed the subject. "Hey, you want to hear a joke?" he asked. Kendra nodded her head slightly. "Why does an orange laugh at a funeral?" he asked. "Why?" "Because it doesn't have any peelings." He started to laugh and Kendra joined in, unsure whether she even understood it. Still, the two of them kept their distance, both refusing to cross the tracks. When Kendra looked up to ask Ben for another joke, he was gone, replaced by another man she knew. It was her father. He stood as still as one of Ben's statues, staring back at Kendra with empty eyes. In a heap near his right foot was the boy of an overweight child, his face now gone. It was peeled away from his bone, revealing a grinning skull. Mr. Simpson smiled at her with a mouth full of sharp teeth. He reached out to her, advancing quickly. Kendra screamed and turned to run, but her sneaker was caught, and she collapsed on her hands. A train whistle pierced through the air, and she could feel the earth quaking under her feet. She screamed. not only attempting to scramble away from the train, but to escape her father and his blood-soaked hands. From somewhere she could hear Ben yelling at her, and then she was falling through a dark and endless space. She thrashed awake in her bed, but there were arms to catch her. She thought it was her mom, but a male voice soothed her back into a regulated breathing. Was it her father? It couldn't be. He hadn't been in her room at all since they moved to the new house. "It's okay, Kendra," the voice said. The arms around her back rocked her back and forth. She felt all her muscles relax. In the dark, it was hard to see, but enough natural light accentuated a young face and a mop of dirty blonde hair. The boy smiled down on her. "There, that's better," he said. "It was only a dream." "Ben?" she asked. "Is that really you?" "Yeah, who else?" he said. "But how?" "I used to live here. Didn't you know that?" Ben said. "This was my room, actually. My bed was over there by the window." He pointed an arm at the opposite wall. "But this is just imaginary," Kendra insisted. "This is just pretend. You don't live here anymore." He nodded. "You're right. Maybe this is just pretend, but it feels real." He was right about that. The pressure in his embrace was warm and cozy, so real that she could feel Ben's breath on her hair and smell the soap on his skin. Ben noticed the diary by Kendra's bedside and picked it up. "I've been looking all over for this," he said. "Where'd you find it?" "In the basement," she responded. Ben's arms dropped away from her as he sat up in the bed. "You shouldn't go down there." "Why?" She sat up next to him. "That's where I hid, the night the man came," he said gravely. "He found me down there, hurt me real bad. He hurt my parents." Kendra thought about the vision she saw of him, of all the blood and cuts across his chest. "Is that the man the gargoyle's waiting for?" she asked. He nodded in the darkness. "Who was the man in your dream, the man covered in all the blood? Did he kill someone?" "My dad," she said. "I don't think he killed anyone." "But that kid was your friend, the dead one." Kendra didn't reply. She stared at her hands. Ben consoled her by hugging her against his chest, his chin resting on her hair. "It's okay," he said. "The bad men always get what they deserve in the end." "But that's my dad. He wouldn't hurt anyone," Kendra explained. "He never hurt us. My mom said he had a breakdown after I almost got hit. He's not bad, only sick." "Do you feel sick too?" Ben asked seriously. "I don't know. I guess so." "Then I'm going to stay here with you. I'll help you get better." Kendra smiled. "You will?" "Oh, thank you, Ben. You're my best friend." "You're my best friend," Ben said to her. "I love you very much." Chapter 5. At first Kendra thought she was still dreaming and expected to wake up in her bed one morning. Yet Ben remained at her side wherever she went, telling jokes and showing her secret places in the house only he could know about. In a short amount of time, Kendra had already accepted that Ben was part of her life, and she didn't need to dream to see him anymore. There was no understanding why or how, only that she suddenly had a friend in the house, someone she could talk to. Kendra spent her days upstairs with Ben, who was always there in bed with her when they woke up in the morning. He always wore the same t-shirt and jeans and never needed to eat or drink. Still, he was as solid as anyone, and he spoke to her as if he was really there. The bed even dipped under his weight when he sat down on it. Kendra had heard of imaginary friends before and wondered if this was what it was really like. She thought it was all just baby stuff, but Ben seemed to be special. One day she walked downstairs with Ben at her heels just as her mom returned home from work. She breezed right past Ben as if never seeing him and kissed Kendra's head, asking her how her day was. Ben stood in the corner with his arms crossed, smiling. He liked to be invisible, which allowed him to make faces at Kendra's mom right in front of her face. Kendra could never control her laughter, inciting a confused reaction from her mom. "Why can't anyone see you and I can?" Kendra asked Ben one morning as they lay in bed together. "I don't know," he said. "I remember after I got attacked in the basement, no one could see me in the house. People came in cleaning and moving furniture, and I couldn't get their attention, even if I yelled right in their face. I got tired of all that and left the house, and you know what I found? Arts Park, just as I always imagined it. I decided I would never leave that place again." "But you left it to be with me?" He reached over and laced his fingers with Kendra's. You came and visited me in the park. I thought I'd come find you. And you were at those train tracks. Do you go there a lot?" "I try not to. Sometimes I have bad nightmares of getting stuck on the tracks again. I can never pull myself out." It was such a relief to be able to talk to Ben about what happened that night. She was able to tell him about her best friend George, who died that day, and his friend Aaron, the boy who left her to die. But obviously he'd come back for her along with George. They'd both come back to help, but were too late. She'd even allowed herself to cry in front of Ben, the only person who really understood her. On that day, they talked about Kendra's parents and her past, too busy to even play. They saved that for their dreams, when they went to sleep to visit Art's park. There in the park, the sun was always out, and it was always the height of the afternoon. On one occasion, as they lounged in the grass together, another boy happened upon them and called Kendra by name. She sat up at the familiarity of the voice and laid eyes on George running up to them, waving his arms. He was still wearing his clothes from the night of the accident, a baggy sweatshirt and pants. "George!" she cried. They ran into each other's arms and laughed, jumping up and down. "This is George," Kendra said to Ben, and both boys shook hands, smiling at each other. "I haven't seen you in so long. I thought you were gone." George looked confused. "I haven't gone anywhere. I've been in the same place as always. It's you that's been gone. I've looked all over, and I finally found you." "This is your neighbor, George?" Ben asked Kendra. She nodded her head excitedly. "I thought you said he was dead." Kendra looked back at George, searching his eyes. "They said you were. I never saw you again. But they were wrong. You're here." She hugged him again, and he put his hand on the back of her head. "Kendra, I've walked so far," George said. "I'm so tired, and I can't even remember yesterday. But I knew I had to find you. I could never forget what happened to us." "What is it?" she asked, breaking away from his embrace. "Aaron's dead," George replied. "Someone killed him." "Who?" Ben chimed in. George looked over Kendra's head at him. "Who are you?" Ben looked around. "I'm the one who built this park. Me and Kendra are friends." "You built this?" George looked stunned, looking around for the first time. "Sure," Ben shrugged. "I used to live here. Now I stay with Kendra." "Do you really know this guy?" George bent low so he wouldn't be heard. "Ben knows everything about," Kendra said. "He knows what happened to us that night." "You told him everything?" George asked. She nodded. "Then you know what happened to Aaron, then?" Kendra nodded again. "I'm so sorry. Your dad was really mad at us. He blamed us for leaving you on the tracks, so he punished us. I feel so horrible. I didn't mean to leave you. It was just he had this look in his eye like fire." "What are you talking about?" Kendra said. "He saved me. Don't you know? I heard the train and ran to help you. I saw Aaron on the hill watching. I yelled at him to help, and he finally did. But neither of us saw your dad running down behind us. He grabbed us both and threw us on the tracks. It was horrible. I tried to get up." George trailed off to dig his fingers in his hair, his face screwed up in a painful knot. "Your dad pulled you out in time, but he pushed me back in the way. Aaron ran, but he caught him. He was bleeding so much." Kendra closed her eyes with a loud ringing in her ears. She saw the sparks again in the spotlight of the train, burning out her vision. Her body trembled with an intense vibration that seemed to rattle the very world around her. Then she screamed, and when she woke up, Ben was holding her again under the covers, humming in her ear. He wouldn't. He. Kendra sobbed. "Your dad's one of them," Ben said. "The bad men." "No, no." "I'll keep you safe from him. I promise you." "What about George? He's dead, isn't he?" "But you aren't." After a long and restless night, Kendra went down to the kitchen with Ben trailing behind her. Her mom had already gone to work, and her dad was never awake that early in the morning. She hardly ever saw him. In fact, out of the many weeks Ben had lived with the Simpson family, he hadn't seen her father once. Until that day. They stopped in their tracks. Mr. Simpson was standing in the middle of the kitchen, staring at an open fridge. He was dressed in nothing but boxer shorts and a white tank top stained yellow with his sweat. At the sound of Kendra's footsteps, he turned his head mechanically in their direction, his expression blank. He had lost so much weight since she last looked at him closely, face shallow and cheekbones accentuated. "Hi, Dad," Kendra managed. "Sorry to bother you. I'll just go." She brushed past Ben to leave the kitchen, but her father called her back. "I love you, Kendra," he said quietly. She turned around, and he was actually smiling. "You know that, don't you, sweetie?" Yes." "I wouldn't let anyone hurt you. No bad men." "Bad men like you?" Ben snapped. Mr. Simpson's eyes flashed toward Ben and focused there. Ben was taken aback to be spotted, and he backed up against the wall. "I know you," Mr. Simpson said to Ben with a smile. "I saw your face in the paper. You lived here. Your family was killed." Mr. Simpson bared his teeth in a mischievous snarl. "And so were you, downstairs in the basement." Ben's face lost its color and he looked sick. Kendra reached forward to grab him, but he had already slid down the wall in a faint with his eyes rolling in his head. Kendra shrieked, but Ben disappeared before he hit the ground. She blinked feverishly in his absence. From behind her, her father laughed. She looked back and he was sitting at the table, banging his fist so hard the pepper shaker jumped in the air. He howled like a dog, spit running down his chin. Kendra tore out of the kitchen and up the stairs, her father's laughter loud enough to meet her under her covers, even with her bedroom door closed. What scared her the most was the realization that she was now alone in the house with her dad, one of the bad men. Chapter 6. In her dream, Dark Horse rode up to her as she lay in the grass. The hero pulled his green hood away from his bald head, and Kendra recognized the blue eyes she'd always written about. Dark Horse smiled down on her and offered her one gloved hand. She took it, and Dark Horse hauled her to her feet. "Leave him to the park," Dark Horse said with a deep voice. "Lead him here, and we will do the rest." "Who?" Kendra asked. The knight spread his arms, and she could see Art's Park spread out below her, the tower casting its dark shadow over the land. The red smoke emitting from the tip of the tower was nauseous and thick. She heard the gargoyle scream from the hellfire. Suddenly, she watched Ben's sculptures step out of their displays. They stood strong at her side, and she felt all the energy return to her body. She'd felt so alone and scared after Ben disappeared. But now she knew she wasn't alone. Children her age and younger stepped out from behind the sculptures and watched her sadly. Kendra turned in a circle and counted them, 12 in all, boys and girls of all ages. She recognized one of the boys as George, and he rushed forward to take her hand. "Who are these people, George?" she asked. "They came to watch what happens next," George explained. "They want closure, to know it's over." Kendra watched as Aaron stepped out of the crowd. For a moment his face was normal, complete with his double chin and tall forehead. Then the image changed. What stared back at her from the top of Aaron's shoulders was a pink and grinning skull. His empty sockets cried tears of blood. Kendra hid her face in George's chest, but he told her it was okay. Aaron had left. She looked back to see he was right, yet she knew he'd be back. "Your dad didn't stop with us," George explained. "He killed others, all these kids. Ben gathered them here to see your father one last time." "Ben? Where is he?" She looked around wildly, as if expecting to see him in the crowd of dead faces. "He'll meet you soon," George said. "He's preparing for the show. Somehow he plans to bring your dad here." Kendra swallowed. Her head was spinning, and she could feel her surroundings starting to slip. This was always a sign that she was about to wake up. Fully lucid to the dream, Kendra asked George if she was dead too. He could only laugh. "You'd know if you were," was all he said. A horse whinnied and Dark Horse galloped into view, giving Kendra a quick salute. "Watch out for Boone, and remember, only you can finish the story." Then the horse galloped away. Kendra woke up to the sunlight. She was alone in bed, Ben's diary left untouched on her nightstand. She sighed and buried her face in her hands to cry. "You want to hear a joke?" She looked up through her fingers, surprised to see Ben smiling at her from the foot of her bed. "Ben, you're okay." She reared up out of her covers and hugged him gladly. "So, you are alive!" she exclaimed. Her tears spotted the collar of Ben's shirt. "No, Kendra," Ben said, holding her at arm's length. "I can't pretend anymore. I thought I could just act like it never happened and hide in Art's Park forever. You helped me wake up from my fantasy. I went down to the basement today and saw where it happened. I touched the dry blood still on the concrete. I'm dead, and I can't deny it anymore." "My dad," Kendra struggled to organize her thoughts. "Was he the one who hurt you?" He shook his head solemnly. "Your dad wasn't the man. I don't think I'll ever see my bad man again, and I'm okay with that. I've made peace with what happened, but your dad is just as bad. You were brought to this house for a reason, so I could help you end this. I can't help myself, but I can help you. You're not safe with him, and neither is your mom." "But what can we do?" Kendra pleaded. Ben smiled. "I'll do everything, don't worry." He leaned forward and kissed her on the forehead, and right before her eyes, Ben vanished again. Chapter 7. Kendra was dreaming, although she wasn't aware. She was back at Art's Park, gazing up at the red smoke at the top of the tower. She marveled at the stone gargoyle, which shone a glossy orange. She watched as the statue turned its head in her direction, its eyes brighter than two headlights. A forked tongue unrolled from its slack jaw, blood coursing down its chin in streams. Kendra crossed the grounds and stared up from the base of the tower. In the distance, she could hear a train whistle, and it sounded like it was getting closer. She looked around, panicked, unsure of what to do. She wasn't surprised to see the train tracks laid out in front of the tower. Her father was on the other side of the tracks again, standing over the dead body. He locked eyes with her, raising his dripping hands in the air. His teeth were fangs. "I love you, Kendra," he moaned. "Come on, sweetie. I want to hold you." He stepped forward, over the first train track. Kendra cowered against the base of the tower, ready to run, but something moved behind her father and she had to stop. The brush stirred as the children stepped out of their hiding places, filling the gully like streams of fish. Mr. Simpson didn't notice them. He was too focused on Kendra. Suddenly, one of the statues came up behind Mr. Simpson and wrapped its arms across his chest in a deadly bear hug. He screamed as the stone cowboy tightened its hold. Kendra could hear splintering cracks from her father's pelvis. Mr. Simpson cried out again, clawing desperately at the statue's arms. Then the cowboy threw Mr. Simpson across the grounds like a rag doll, where he crashed at the feet of the knight statue. The cowboy's face cracked open in a petrifying grin, eyes red, blue mist exhaling from its carved nose. The horse galloped to the cowboy's side, and he lifted himself onto the saddle in a single movement. Kendra watched her father scramble to regain his feet, coughing up blood and heaving violently. He tried to stand, but his pelvis was so twisted he collapsed on his back and cried like a child. Then a marble sword sliced inches from Mr. Simpson's scalp. He looked up through a screen of blood at the laughing knight, lumbering toward him. It stabbed at him with its heavy sword. Mr. Simpson dodged it, falling over with another sickening crack. The knight lifted one armored foot, threatening to crush his head in. Scarlet eyes peered out at him from the darkness of its helmet. Mr. Simpson laughed up at the marble sculpture, eyes closed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The knight screamed furiously and stomped its boot into his gut. Kendra screamed for the knight to stop, and the statue's torso disintegrated. The rest of it fell on top of her father, pinning him to the concrete. The sword buried itself in the grass with delicate ease. Kendra ran forward to help, but the ground shook with the approach of the massive tiki man. It hobbled in her direction, spitting black smoke through its mouth, like a tailpipe on a car. Kendra yelped and ran as fast as she could. All around her were the grim faces of the children, standing on the train tracks and watching silently. They watched as her father died under the pile of rubble. She wanted to tell them to go, to leave and never return again, and as soon as she thought it, the children disappeared from the gully. From overhead, the gargoyle screeched, and Kendra looked up to see it was airborne, circling over Mr. Simpson's body like a vulture. The tiki man had dragged Mr. Simpson's broken body out of the rubble and was dangling him in the air upside down, inches from its nose. It breathed dark smoke over him. Then the gargoyle swooped down with bat wings and plucked Mr. Simpson into the air. The creature carried him to the top of the tower, which was still pouring red smoke like a volcano. The last Kendra heard of her father was his blood-wrenching scream as they disappeared behind the smoky veil, plunging into the depths of the volcano. Then everything went still. There was no train whistle, and all the statues were back in their rightful places at the base of the tower. She was surprised to see the red smoke was gone, and the gargoyle was missing from the top. "Why does an orange laugh at a funeral?" Ben asked from behind her. She turned around. The train tracks were still there, and Ben and George were standing there on the ties, unafraid. They had their hands around each other's shoulders like old friends, beaming happily. They waved for her to join them. Kendra didn't hesitate to join them on the train tracks, all three of them laughing and hugging. "Thank you for bringing me and George together," Ben said to Kendra. "Now we don't have to move on alone. It's better with other people." "You're leaving?" Kendra asked sadly. "The bad man's defeated," George replied. "There's nothing left to the story." Kendra thought about the brave dark horse and how he always defeated the evil Boone at the end of their stories. She couldn't help but smile. To know that her dad was gone was the biggest relief, as if a weight had lifted from her home. There'd be no more sickness, no more scary outbursts, and sneaking around the house. She was finally free to breathe. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked them both. They both nodded. "Yeah, every once in a while," Ben answered, "as long as you keep dreaming." Kendra suddenly burst out laughing. "Ha! I get it now. No peelings." The boys smiled and faded into the air. It was still dark when Kendra rose up out of her sleep. Somehow she knew her father was gone. He'd left the house in the night, and just like Ben promised, he wouldn't come back. The bedroom door opened and Kendra seized in her bed. She relaxed when her mom stepped inside, wearing her work clothes and wearing a worried expression. "I can't find your father," her mom said. "He left the house, I think." "Do you know where he went?" He's gone, Mom, Kendra said with tears in her eyes. What? He's gone. Kendra started laughing, wiping the tears from her eyes. He won't ever come back. Oh, thank God. She threw her hands in the air and joined Kendra in bed, laughing and bouncing on their knees. That day she didn't go to work. Epilogue. 20 miles down the road, yellow caution tape ruffled in the breeze of a brand new morning. Police picked through the trash in the gully, searching for a clue, but finding nothing except for Mr. Simpson's severed foot in the grass 10 feet from the rest of his body. On the train tracks, what was left of Mr. Simpson dried in the cresting sunlight. A smashed skull reared up at the sky, grinning broken teeth at the policeman. 2 eyes stared down the line of tracks, as if waiting for the next train. The conductor of the train would later say that Mr. Simpson, dressed in his pajamas, had walked willingly in front of his train, and had stood there for a good 20 seconds before the train struck him. He hadn't even looked up. His eyes were closed, as if sleepwalking. The conductor was insistent that Mr. Simpson was waiting for the train to hit him. He refused to move from the tracks, no matter how many times the conductor blasted the whistle. At the last second, he thought he saw Mr. Simpson's mouth move in a scream, blood gushing down his skin like sweat. He didn't know how he could have heard it over the whistle, but the conductor described hearing the screech of a terrible bird and the flap of its wings as it took to the sky. Perhaps it was only the screech of the brakes he heard. He could admit to that. But there was something about the way Mr. Simpson screamed at the last second, his cheeks splitting open and gushing blood as if invisible talons were busy stealing his face from his head.